On November 24, 1859, a long queue formed outside a bookstore in London, England, as people vied to buy a newly published book. This book caused an uproar the moment it appeared. To people of that time, this book was undoubtedly mind-blowing because the Bible said species were created by God and were eternal and unchanging. But this newly published book boldly denied that, arguing that all things in the world were not created by God, but gradually evolved from lower to higher forms. People jostled at the bookstore entrance, everyone wanting to see what this godly book was actually called. One little boy pushed left and right, finally squeezing to the very front. He focused his eyes and saw the book was titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, abbreviated as On the Origin of Species. The author was Darwin. My name is Charles Robert Darwin. On February 12, 1809, I was born in a small town in England named Shrewsbury. Both my grandfather and my father were local doctors. I never wanted for food or clothing from a young age, and my family was very wealthy. Since childhood, my home had a laboratory. My brother and I often conducted experiments in there because we had a laboratory at home. So from a young age, I loved gathering all sorts of experimental materials from nature. And I was also particularly fond of daydreaming. When I was only a few years old, one day I was loosening the soil around a tree in our garden, and my mother told me that soil is a wonderful thing. Trees need soil to grow, and it's precisely because of the soil that grass grows, which feeds the cattle and sheep. So our family has milk to drink and meat to eat. When you're a child, that's the time of great curiosity. Hearing my mother's words, I asked her, "Mother, you say that? So can puppies grow from the soil?" My mother replied, "No, because puppies are born from their mother. They don't grow from the soil." I continued to ask her, "I was born from my mother. And the mother was born from grandmother, right?" "That's right. All people are born from their mothers." Thinking this far, my mind suddenly began to feel a bit overwhelmed, and I asked a question that might influence my entire life. I asked her, "Then who gave birth to the very first mother?" My mother answered me without hesitation, saying it was God. The very first mother was born from God. So then, who gave birth to God? I was just about to get to the bottom of it. But my mother couldn't answer that question. She could only say to me, "Child, there are many things in this world that remain a mystery to us. You just grow up quickly. This mystery is waiting for you to solve it." So, holding on to such an ideal, I slowly grew up. When I was 8 years old, my mother passed away. From 8 to 16, I attended Shrewsbury School, which was a church school. Every day I heard the teachers reciting the Bible, and it gave me a headache. I particularly loved natural history, chemistry, and natural science. I disliked the school's education, so I often went fishing by the river after class. I climbed trees to collect bird eggs. I hunted. I collected minerals and made specimens of plants and animals. We had a laboratory at home, so I could do whatever I wanted. And so I slowly passed through my childhood and teenage years. In my 16th year, I assisted my father in treating the poor in our town.
And I became an apprentice doctor.
But as I assisted my father, he couldn't help but think his child's medical skills were terribly poor. So that autumn, I was sent to the University of Edinburgh to study medicine. When I left, my father instructed me, telling me to study hard, as the family practice was waiting for me to inherit it. Well, upon entering the University of Edinburgh, I realized I actually had no desire at all to study medicine. Why? Because I couldn't stand surgery, especially the copious blood on the operating table. So much so that every time I was at the operating table, I couldn't bring myself to make the incision. There was no other way. I could only frequently go into the wild to collect plant and animal specimens. As I went along, I discovered that nature was far more interesting than the operating table. After entering my second year at university, I joined the Plinian Society, an academic group focused on natural history. During my time in the society, I conducted research on 2 types of aquatic organisms and made some interesting discoveries. With the society's help, I published the first 2 papers of my life. That year, I was only 17 years old. Afterwards, I also assisted the University of Edinburgh Museum in large-scale artifact collection. Not wanting to study medicine, I often snuck into the neighboring biology department to attend lectures. As I listened, I found this biology teacher often promoted a French scientist named Lamarck. Lamarck believed living things were not created by God, but evolved. For example, the reason a giraffe's neck is long is because it wanted to make its neck longer. So it stretched and stretched. I thought and thought to myself, hey, there's some sense to Lamarck's theory. After studying at the University of Edinburgh for 2 years, I really couldn't stand the surgical environment and the tedious medical knowledge. I returned home and I told my father, Dad, I don't want to study medicine anymore. My father saw me idling about with no proper occupation and having no real interest in medicine. He began to scold me. You care about nothing except hunting, keeping dogs, and catching rats. You have no concern for anything else. In a fit of anger, he sent me off to the University of Cambridge to study theology instead. Yes, since I myself didn't want to study medicine, my father hoped I would become a respectable clergyman in the future so that I could have a decent profession, allowing me to continue my passion for natural history, and I wouldn't bring shame upon the family. I thought about it, nodded my head, and went to the University of Cambridge. In the year 1928, I was 19 years old that year, and I entered the divinity school at Cambridge University. But at Cambridge, I still had a little interest in theology. Instead, my interest in natural history grew even stronger. I often went out wandering around, and I remember one day in 1928, I was in a forest on the outskirts of London, and I saw an old tree. I observed it closely and suddenly noticed a worm wriggling under the peeling bark. I quickly peeled back the bark and saw 2 peculiar beetles crawling forward. I immediately grabbed them and began to examine them. Just then, a 3rd beetle jumped out from under the bark. I was caught off guard and didn't have enough hands, so I could only put 1 beetle in my mouth and reached out to catch the 3rd one. Looking at these beetles, I couldn't bear to put them down. I kept observing and observing. I forgot about the beetle in my mouth, and finally, the beetle in my mouth couldn't hold it in any longer and released a pungent toxic fluid, which stung my tongue, making it numb and painful. Only then did I spit the beetle into my hand. Later, this beetle was also named Darwin's beetle. The reason I tell this story is to say to you, I really truly had a very, very deep interest in natural science. At Cambridge University, I also met the then very famous botanist and beetle expert, John Stevens Henslow, and the geologist Adam Sedgwick. They both also found it novel that a divinity student had such a great interest in natural science and were willing to teach me. So during that time, I received scientific training in botany and geology research, and the days passed like that. In February 1831, that year I was 22 years old. I graduated. Although I didn't much like it, my performance in theology was still excellent. Even though I told my father many times while at school, I really don't want to study theology. I have no interest in theology at all. You're making me study theology. I'd rather have been digging for loaches in the fields every day. but in the end, I did study it. To be perfectly honest, I later reflected that my 3 years at Cambridge were entirely wasted apart from studying natural science, which truly interested me. Most of my other time was spent on horse racing, hunting, and drinking. I also admit that theology degree was completely useless for my future life. Alright, to get back on track, I graduated in February that year, but I didn't leave immediately. I took Henslow's advice and continued living at the college, staying until June, so he could properly teach me natural science. Then I joined Adam Sedgwick's geology course, assisting in the study of the Welsh strata. While I was deep in this research, without my knowing it, the greatest turning point in my life arrived. The turning point in my life was joining the Beagle's global survey voyage. At that time, the British Navy dispatched Officer Fitzroy on the Beagle to survey the coasts of South America and other regions, and chart the navigation routes. However, the officer's originally invited companion was unable to go, so he went to ask Professor Henslow. Professor Henslow thought it over left and right. Hey, didn't he have a student named Darwin? He was also interested in such things. Why not recommend him to give it a try? So this good fortune fell upon my head, and I naturally went gladly. Thus, on December 27, 1831, 22-year-old me, as a naturalist, paid my own way to board the ship and set sail from Plymouth Harbor aboard HMS Beagle, beginning a long and arduous global survey expedition. From that moment on, I embarked on a journey that would completely change the life sciences. Hearing this, you might want to ask, where exactly did our voyage go? Actually, the Beagle's route started from Britain, first down to Africa, from Africa across the South Atlantic, reaching Brazil, then from Brazil sailing south along the east coast of South America, reaching Rio, then via the Falkland Islands and Tierra del Fuego in the South Atlantic. We rounded the Strait of Magellan, sailed north along the west coast of South America, crossed the Indian Ocean from Australia, reached Madagascar, then crossed the Atlantic, past the Cape of Good Hope back to Brazil, and finally sailed directly home from Brazil. The journey lasted 57 months, and I finally returned to England on October 2, 1836, taking nearly 5 years and covering tens of thousands of kilometers. Although the global expedition was full of hardships, to be perfectly honest, it truly opened my eyes. From this voyage, I brought back quite a few treasures, and these treasures took me the entire second half of my life to organize and publish. How much was there? According to incomplete statistics, I brought back a total of 368 pages of zoological notes, 1,383 pages of geological notes, 770 pages of diary, and 1,529 species specimens preserved in alcohol bottles, 3,907 dried species specimens, not to mention the live turtles I caught on the other islands. So after returning to England, some of my specimens and letters began circulating in British scientific circles, and many scientists already regarded me as a colleague. They thought Darwin possessed such great perseverance. I accepted that. As my reputation gradually grew, I slowly transitioned from an amateur naturalist to a renowned naturalist. The academic world recognized me. I thought my own research path must continue. At that time, I had completely forgotten my father's expectations. What priest, what theology had nothing to do with me. I began consulting a large number of books and organizing materials. I was going to start writing my first notebook on species transmutation. But as I was writing, my family wasn't idle either. They began considering my future. They wanted to arrange a marriage for me. In July 1838, I was 29 years old at the time. On a trip back to my mother's family home, I met my cousin Emma. My family wanted to recommend Emma to me. At that time, I wrote down on paper marry and not marry, and wrote down their respective pros and cons. I wrote the advantages of marriage, well, always having someone by my side, a companion for old age, at least better than a dog. And the disadvantages of marriage were, I wouldn't have much money left for books. It would waste a lot of time. And I wasn't sure if it was worth it, but my parents kept urging me to meet her. So I thought I'd just go and see. After I met Emma, I didn't ask her for a relationship. Instead, I explained my theory of species evolution to her. I thought, since she was a devout Christian, she would surely reject me now. But to my surprise, she understood me very well, and even showed some interest in what I was talking about. I thought it over and over and decided this person was quite worth it. So the two of us were finally married in January 1839. 1 month before the wedding, I was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. It was the icing on the cake for me. In December 1839, my first child, William, was born. In the following 15 years, my wife and I had 10 children in a row. Of course, that was all later. In the year 1842, I was 33 years old. Our family moved to a country residence at Down House, on the outskirts of London. For my research, the garden and greenhouse there were a perfect natural laboratory. And due to my personal achievements and substantial family wealth, I could ensure that my wife, my children, and I would live comfortably for the rest of our lives. During that period, I began to live my life while continuing my research. But around that time, I began to fall ill, and my condition grew increasingly severe. A friend who knew me well once described me from that period. Darwin was gravely ill, looking like a ghost. I had thought about sailing again, to see the world once more. But my prolonged illness extinguished that idea. Life thereafter was a struggle against illness. While publishing papers and books, I thought to myself, I must do something meaningful. So I spent a full 22 years. I secluded myself, and on November 24, 1859, published that monumental work on the origin of species, which led to the scene you saw at the beginning of the video, people vying to buy it because what I wrote was beyond their comprehension, because what I wrote was too far ahead of its time. In the year 1860, the British Association for the Advancement of Science held a great debate on evolution at its annual meeting at Oxford University, but due to time constraints, I won't elaborate on it for you. Later, from 1863 to 1865, my illness grew increasingly severe. In 1868, I published The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication. In the year 1871, I published The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. In the year 1872, I published The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. For the next 9 years, I was recuperating, slowly conducting research. In the year 1881, I published my work on earthworms. Finally, on April 19, 1882, I passed away at home at the age of 73. My life ends here. His name was Darwin. At the age of 50, he published On the Origin of Species because his theory was too far ahead of its time. It was fiercely attacked. The church considered it a heretical doctrine, denied all his views, vigorously promoted divine power, and declared that Darwin should be executed. And within the scientific community, supporters of Lamarckism also attacked him relentlessly. As ordinary people, they also followed the crowd, unwilling to believe him, just wanting to see what was so amazing about this mind-blowing book. Darwin was in pain. As a scientist, a naturalist, he sought neither fame nor fortune, took risks, endured hardships, and poured his heart and soul into creating this work. But those who believed him at that time could be counted on one hand. Before publishing On the Origin of Species, he already had a comfortable life,
substantial family property,
and more money than he could spend in his entire lifetime. But he still took that step. 9 years after On the Origin of Species was published, The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication was released, using irrefutable facts and rigorous scientific arguments to further elaborate the theory of evolution. After that, he published many other works, including The Descent of Man. We need to understand that was an era ruled by religion. Everyone around him completely believed in deities, believing they were created by God. As long as one was sincere towards God, they would attain happiness, and after death, enter heaven. But Darwin told us, you are not created by God. You evolved from other species. When we look back from today's world, we find the entire foundation of modern biology is built upon Darwin's ideas. Because of him, biology underwent a revolutionary change. Beyond that, he also had a tremendous influence on anthropology, psychology, and philosophy. All these disciplines have branch concepts rooted in evolutionary theory. 40 years, one book, On the Origin of Species. For the first time, he demystified the biological world. For the first time, he infused the study of man and nature with greater vitality. Through the accumulation of bit by bit, he formed the concept of the origin of species. And the origin of species, in turn, tells us that the development of the biological world can also rely entirely on bit-by-bit accumulation, using vast stretches of time to form the complete pathway of evolutionary appearance. He tells us an eternal truth. The world changes gradually. Even if drastic changes appear within a very short time, it never lacks a process. The same holds true for all other things.